In this paper, I shall discuss the development of small-scale rural credit in the countryside of the city of Lucca in northwestern Tuscany over the decades straddling the 12th and the 13th centuries. I will divide my presentation into two main parts. First, I will outline the main aspects of the political and economic history of Lucca and its environs during the central medieval period, with a focus on the decades from roughly the 1170s to the 1230s. It is essential to do so, as those circa 60 years witnessed some major changes in the institutional and economic structure of what I shall call from now on the Lucchesia, that is, the region surrounding Lucca. Those changes constitute, moreover, the cause of the subsequent expansion of credit activities and of the steadily increasing integration of urban and rural economy. In the second part of the paper, I will focus my attention on a specific source, the book that a Lucchese notary, Ciabatto, kept for one of his clients, a moneylender of Jewish origins but Christian faith, named Usacco, son of the late Simeone, during the 1230s and the early 1240s. Usacco's book is one of the many notarial registers, or protocols, that started to be preserved in the ecclesiastical archives of Lucca from the 1220s onwards. We shall look at it in more detail in due course. For now, it is sufficient to explain what a notarial register is and why this type of source is important. Notarial registers are manuscript texts in book form which used to have full legal validity in 13th century Italy. They include deeds which were usually written down in abbreviated form, and this is why those deeds are often referred to as imbreviature in Italian. This way of recording notarized agreements between people represented a real turning point in the history of notarial documentation. First of all, it needs stressing that imbreviature books give plenty of information on the notary's clienteles, thus shedding light on a social milieu that otherwise would be shrouded in darkness, and that is precisely the case with Usacco of the late Simeone. Secondly, and more importantly, notarial protocols cover a wide range of matters, going, just to make a couple of examples, from court cases concerning marriage annulment to the administration of law justice within the seigneurial enclave that were scattered across the jurisdictional remit of Lucca. In other words, notarial registers unveil many aspects of everyday or quasi-everyday medieval life, some of which would be hardly visible without them. And what is relevant to this paper, they allow us to study small-scale rural credit too. Let us start with the first part of my presentation, an outline of the political and economic history of Lucca and its countryside during the central medieval period. I have already said why we need to focus on the decades between circa 1170 and circa 1230, but here I must explain why it is worth spending a few words on the 11th and 12th centuries as a whole. Indeed, the incomparably rich archives of the Lucchese diocese, with original single-sheet parchments surviving in their thousands from the early 8th century, together with the political importance of the city, which was the main seat of the Marquis of Tuscia, the Carolingian administrative district whose boundaries largely overlapped with those of modern-day Tuscany, make room for some preliminary remarks on the integration of urban and rural economy. Two books published by Chris Wickham in 1988 and 1995 on medieval Lucca and its hinterland have shown that the political dominance of the city over its surrounding plain was matched by its economic dominance. First of all, Lucca housed a huge agricultural market, possibly already in the 9th century and certainly from the mid-11th century, when references to it in the sources became quite frequent. It has been estimated that during the 12th century, 25% of the population of the area lived within the city walls or in the suburbs. Those people were probably fed, for the most part at least, with the products that came from the Lucchesia. That Lucca had no easy access to the sea, unlike its neighboring rival, Pisa, and could rely only on an imperfect market integration at a regional level, points in this direction. Indeed, after the breakup of the March of Tuscia in the late 11th century, Tuscany was divided into a series of localized rural lordships and independent cities, including Lucca, which were frequently at war with each other. Market exchanges were therefore heavily hampered by the fragmentation of public powers and recurrent military conflicts. In addition to these, it is notable that 11th and 12th century sources allow us to observe some degree of market and city-oriented agricultural specialization. Wheat fields prevailed on the plains, whereas vineyards and olive trees were more numerous on the hills. In a nutshell, I would argue that the localization of political power, which followed the disappearance of the March of Tuscia, implied that the city control over the countryside was the sine qua non of the city prosperity, and the signs of agricultural specialization in the Lucchesia appear to confirm this pattern. The integration of urban and rural economy seems to have accelerated throughout the 12th century. The major change that occurred during that period consisted in the steadily growing preference for the collection of renting produce instead of renting money. Wickham wrote that, and I quote, "This fact is in itself a sign of the importance of the city market, for landlords began to wish to exploit it directly rather than leave their tenants to do so." In other words, landowners showed an increasing interest in the profit they could make out of the direct sale of agricultural produce on the city market, which appeared more advantageous than the exaction of cash rents from their leaseholders. It should be noted, moreover, that during the same century some members of the Lucchese elite started to buy rents instead of rights of property over land. This proves that the market of foodstuff was by then detached, to an extent, from the ownership of rural estates. Given the social status of the people involved in these operations, it is highly unlikely that produce was used for self-consumption. The purchase of rents in kind appears therefore to have been a chiefly commercial and market-oriented phenomenon. One may wonder at this point what the Lucchese people were doing in the city, that is, what the core of urban economy was. Yet we do not know much about this. The full range of economic activities that were carried out in Lucca, and I think especially of the local cloth industry, which was the backbone of Lucchese international export, surfaces only from notarial registers, and so from the 1220s onwards, thanks to the wealth of information that this particular type of source enshrines. This does not mean, however, that such activities were absent in the previous decades. The preservation of notarial protocols within Lucchese archives from the first half of the 13th century on is due, to an extent at least, to pure chance. To this I shall come back later on. As a result, one cannot conclude that the economic context unveiled by notarial registers had not existed at all before the registers began to be preserved. In order to grasp the characteristics of urban economy in 12th century Lucca, we have to rely on the sparse references to a manufacturing sector concerning silk and wool, which we occasionally find in the single-sheet parchments of the late 12th century, and which seem to point to the existence of local industry that was already developed, even though we barely see it. These would contribute to further explaining the commercialization of agrarian economy and its integration with the urban one. This leads us to the historical phase which needs closer investigation, the one starting from the late 12th century. As I said at the beginning, the expansion of credit activities can be traced back to that particular moment, and I shall try to explain why. From 1154 to 1183, the cities of northern central Italy were involved in the wars against Emperor Frederick I, who endeavored to re-establish imperial rule over the by then largely independent Italian cities. The communes, as they were often called, and as they are called right now. The prolonged state of warfare caused a surge in military expenses on the part of urban governing bodies and led to the building of new circuits of city walls. Both before and after the Peace of Constance in 1183, in which the Comuni and the Empire reached a complex agreement on their respective jurisdictional prerogatives, urban governments were taxed. With regard to Lucca, this is proved by the diplomas, that is, the official documents issued by the royal authority granted to the Lucchesi from the 1150s to the 1180s, which entailed the payment of an annual tribute on the part of the citizens. Albeit not being extremely high, that tribute represented nonetheless a true innovation in the relationships between urban governments and the overarching imperial authority. In response to heightened imperial demand, the cities began to levy taxes on the rural communities subject to their authority on an increasingly regular basis. The ever-growing exploitation of the countryside came to be a stable feature of urban rule in northern central Italy during the first decades of the 13th century, when the ebbing of imperial power, which was utterly weakened after the death of Frederick I in 1190 and his son Henry VI in 1197, made room for the definitive consolidation of the city's local authority. This growth in aggregate demand, and I prefer here to speak of aggregate and not just fiscal demand, as we need to take into account also an underlying trend of demographic and urban growth, pushed up the prices of landed estates and agricultural products. A German scholar, Arnold Hesch, who devoted his 1974 Habilitationsschrift to the economic history of Lucca in the 12th century, calculated that from 1165 to 1195, prices went up by circa 300%, which is all the more notable when we consider that those same prices had been relatively stable until then. This state of affairs triggered a reaction on the part of local landowners. Esch convincingly demonstrated that agricultural renters, by then prevailingly, but by no means exclusively in kind, followed a curve similar to that of prices over the same period. This overall increase in Lucchese landowners' demand was not uncontested. When you raise rents, you have to expect hostile reactions from the tenantry. And indeed, it is precisely from the 1170s that Lucchese charters start to mention withheld renders, in Latin afflicta retenta, as a growing number of peasants did not manage to pay what was due. In at least one case, moreover, we have evidence of organized resistance against the increase in seigneurial exactions. In more detail, the inhabitants of the castle of Massarosa, northwest of Lucca, which was placed under the jurisdiction of the canons of the Lucchese Cathedral, actively opposed the harshening of collective obligations that their lords endeavored to impose in the final 20 years of the 12th century. Fortunately, there is no time here to discuss further the Massarosa example, but I thought it was worth citing because of its representativeness. It does testify to a general context of conflicts between landowners and tenants in the Lucchesia as a result of the landowners' increased, heightened demand. It is exactly in this context that we can now analyze the emergence of small-scale rural credit and examine the register that the notary Ciabatto kept for Usacco of the late Simeone. The first thing that needs to be said as clearly as possible is that the origins of rural credit are unknown. The fairly standardized land transactions which have survived within the thousands of Lucchese medieval single-sheet parchments usually concern perpetual rights over rural estates. As a result, they do not make room for loans, which are by definition a temporary agreement, and which come into light only through 13th century notarial protocols. It is probable that credit to agriculturists had always existed in some form, even though we are not able to see it. Nevertheless, I would suggest that the final 30 years of the 12th century are likely to have witnessed a development of the pre-existing networks of rural credit. First of all, the institutional framework that allowed credit transactions to flourish was created, or at least sharpened, from the late 1160s. I am referring here to the creation of new sets of judges in the Lucchese commune, in Latin again, consules treguani, that is, the consuls who were charged with the settlement of disputes in the countryside and who are attested for the first time in 1168, and in Latin again, Curia Sancti Cristofori, which settled disputes between lay people and is first mentioned in 1174. Their appearance in the sources is contemporary to the inflationary trend affecting the prices of land and foodstuff and to the subsequent increase in agricultural rents. Those tribunals must have been regarded as particularly important, if not necessary, during a period in which the relationships between landowners and tenants were becoming increasingly hostile. And we can add that they probably provided for the bureaucratic structure and the juridical background that ensured creditors against defaulting debtors. In other words, for the institutional framework that made credit operations in Lucca and its hinterland relatively safe. It seems no chance, indeed, that the first Lucchese notarial protocol recording loans which we know of, and which has survived as a fragment of just one volume, dates to that period, broadly speaking, to 1204 precisely. In conclusion, although we lack positive evidence, it seems at least likely that rural credit spread at some time between the last quarter of the 12th and the beginning of the 13th centuries. This brings us to the final point of my paper, the register of Usacco of the late Simeone, whose archival shelf mark, which I shall use to identify it from now on, is LL4. First of all, how did we come to have this register? Why are we so well informed about Usacco? The reason lies in the fact that he was a client of the aforementioned notary Ciabatto, who had in turn a close relationship, who was in close contact with the canons of the Lucchese Cathedral of San Martino from the late 1220s at the latest. After Ciabatto's death, the protocols that he kept for his clientele were transferred to the archives of the Cathedral Chapter, where they have been preserved since. This is why we know quite a lot about Usacco, and the way Usacco's protocol has been handed down to us is a strong reminder of the importance of chance for our historical knowledge. There certainly were other notaries like Ciabatto, and in all likelihood other moneylenders like Usacco during the first half of the 13th century in Lucca, but they have been hardly documented. And it is worth noting in relation to this that even Usacco's protocol is incomplete. A German scholar, Andreas Meyer, to whom we owe the edition of other Lucchese notarial protocols, has estimated that several pages are missing. So, what do we have and what do we know? We have 68 folia, which start from the year 1230 and are filled with Usacco's activities. About 400 loans of cash and cereals for the most part. Towards the end of the register, we find Usacco's will, which is dated to November 1240. The final deed in LL4 is stipulated in May 1242 in favor of his wife, Marsubilia, who is by now defined as relicta, widow. Therefore, Usacco died at some point between the autumn of 1240 and the spring of 1242, although we do not know at what age. It is hard to find information about him outside LL4, as he rarely features within the charters preserved in the diocesan archives of Lucca. It is interesting to stress, moreover, that his will does not mention any landed estates as part of the inheritance that his wife and his two sons would receive. We may conclude, thus, that Usacco was no major landowner, but two caveats are necessary. First, that Usacco barely appears in ecclesiastical sources only proves that he was not a beneficiary of ecclesiastical land. Second, his activity as moneylender must have started from somewhere. There must have been some kind of start-up capital, and it is plausible that that capital was constituted by land. I would propose that Usacco, and perhaps his ancestors, belonged to a class of relatively well-off medium-sized landowners, a class that is well documented and remarkably resilient all throughout the medieval period in the Lucchese, who, in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, were in the position to make profit out of the changing economic context, which I have described before. It should be noted that Usacco's protocol allows us to reconsider, in part at least, the opinion expressed by Jean-Louis Gaulin and François Menin in an important essay published in 1998 on the subject of Jewish rural credit in medieval Italy. Gaulin and Menin argued that Jewish rural credit was almost completely absent up to the middle of the 14th century. Usacco's business, as it can be studied through his Notarial Register, seems to point in fact in the opposite direction. All the same, Usacco was, or became at a certain point, as I said at the beginning, Christian. In his will, he agreed to renounce all his illicit earnings, his usure, probably the excessively high interest rates he had managed to obtain, before a canon of the Lucchese Cathedral, who furthermore held his hand, I quote and translate from the Latin, for the salvation of his soul. As a consequence, we cannot consider Usacco's money lending as Jewish money lending, but we can at least suppose that since he and his family certainly came from a Jewish community, they certainly had a Jewish background, and Jewish communities were already involved in credit activities elsewhere in Europe, they are positively attested during this period, money lending must have been reasonably suitable, a particularly suitable career option for him. Let us look finally at the content of LL4. The deeds recorded within Usacco's protocol encapsulate some of the main changes caused by the increase in Lucchese landowners' demand, that is, the need for loans on the part of the local peasantry. These points need discussion, and the first question we need to ask in order to do so regards the nature of credit. What was it for? More exactly, were the loans used to make investments, or were they a response to the shortage of cash and the exhaustion of foodstuffs in the countryside? The answer is complex. First of all, we have to observe that Usacco had a clientele, a group of people who resorted to his services on quite a regular basis. This clientele appears to have been composed, for the most part, by peasants who came from a web of villages which lay close to the city walls of Lucca. In short, they came from the hinterland. We do not know anything about their economic status, which clearly is an obstacle to our understanding of the reasons why those people decided to incur debts with Usacco. But a close look at the transactions they concluded with him can, however, shed some light on those reasons. We find Usacco's clients borrowing relatively small quantities of cereals in return for cash during winter and spring, when the harvests of wheat and millet, the two most cultivated types of grain in the Lucchese, are distant, as they take place, respectively, in late June and late August. These loans took the form of sale credits, which means that the payment was delayed by several months and was due right after the harvest. Peasants were thus allowed to sell the agricultural surplus on the market and get thereby the money they needed in order to return their loans. It needs to be emphasized that, except for the aftermath of the harvest, the majority of medieval peasants rarely had money of their own, including in an age of economic growth, such as the 13th century in northern central Italy. And in fact, some of Usacco's credit activities appear to have been aimed precisely at soothing the effects of that shortage. All throughout the year, he lent out money in exchange for cereals, that is, the exact opposite of the type of operation I have just described, which, it is worth repeating, mostly occurred in winter and spring. Or else he simply lent out money without any apparent payoff, except for the contract clause specifying that the debtor's lands and goods in general were mortgaged as a security in case of default. But such a clause was formulaic, and the actual enforcements of pledges were rare. So, in answer to the question I was posing before, was credit needed to make investments, or was it needed to cope with poverty in the countryside? Two clues make the second option more probable. The generally small size of loans, which are likely to have been used for self-consumption rather than reinvestment, and the seasonality characterizing the loans of cereals, which seems to point to the exhaustion of foodstuffs within peasant households when harvest time was months away. As a result, I would propose that the social class that we can observe in LL4 is composed by those same peasants who, as I argued before, had been burdened with increasingly heavier rents from the 1170s on and were therefore in need for loans. It cannot be completely ruled out that some of those loans, and cash loans especially, were in fact used for investments, nor should we suppose that self-consumption and investment are two mutually exclusive concepts. A peasant who takes out a loan in order to be able to expand his arable land, for instance, might well be trying to guarantee economic security to him and his family while hoping to increase his overall revenues in the long term. Yet I doubt that reinvestment was the rule for Usacco's clients. A few concluding words need to be said on how Usacco made profit out of this business. When cereals were exchanged for money, this is quite clear. Every time Usacco bought cereals, he underpriced them. Every time he sold cereals, he overpriced them, from plus 20 to plus 40%. He lays profit in the different prices of sales and purchases. It is more difficult, however, to understand why he lent out money in return for nothing, except for a rather vague land mortgage, as I noted before. I believe that this can be explained by the notion of clientele. It was in Usacco's best interest to, so to speak, gracefully lend small sums of money to the same people who would buy grain for him at a later stage. This tightened the bond between Usacco and his clients, possibly pushing them to choose him over the other money lenders who ran a similar business in Lucca. And indeed, there is evidence that the same peasants who received cash loans would then exchange cereals for money with Usacco, and Usacco could, at that point, set the price at his best convenience. In conclusion, Usacco's protocol shows how the development of small-scale rural credit in the decades bridging the 12th and the 13th centuries constituted an important step along the path of the integration of urban and rural economy, which had had a long history in Lucca and its hinterland. Rural credit was both a symptom and a consequence of the increased pressure on land and peasants that marked those decades. More exactly, of lords' increased demand. Such a pressure made loans of cash and cereals a widespread tool to which the peasantry had to resort in order to cope with general destitution. Thank you very much.